When people talk about the ancient past of Britain, one idea comes up time and time again: that the Celts arrived in an invasion, replacing the people who were already here. This idea comes from older historical models where cultural change was often explained through the movement of whole populations. Archaeology and genetics now give us a clearer picture. Once those categories are separated, the invasion model no longer fits the evidence. So in this short video, I want to address a simple question: did the Celts invade Britain? A good place to start is with the definitions. In the introduction of Celtic culture, John T. Koch is explicit on this point. Celtic is defined primarily as a language group and not as a race or a biological population. In other words, Celtic refers first and foremost to language and culture. Once Celtic is understood in those terms, the idea of a single invading Celtic people starts to dissolve. A useful comparison comes from a much later and far better documented period. Britain was certainly invaded by Rome, yet the adoption of Roman culture did not involve a wholesale replacement of the existing population. At Driffield Terrace in Roman York, genetic and isotopic analysis shows that most individuals buried there were local, despite clear evidence for Roman cultural identity and practice. The population remains largely continuous, even as language, material culture, and social identity change. The idea of a Celtic invasion developed within earlier ways of thinking about the past. For a long time, archaeology assumed that languages moved with people, material culture mapped directly onto populations, and cultural change implied demographic replacement. Because Celtic languages are historically attested in Iron Age Britain, it felt reasonable to imagine a moment when those speakers arrived as a distinct group. These assumptions predate large-scale ancient DNA studies and are no longer supported by the evidence. This is where the genetic evidence becomes central. Large-scale ancient DNA studies of Britain, particularly Patterson et al., alongside Olalde et al., demonstrate long-term population continuity rather than repeated, invasive replacement. From the Neolithic through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, British populations consistently derive from the same broad ancestral components: Western hunter-gatherer, early European farmer, and steppe-related ancestry. What changes over time is proportion and not the underlying substrate. Crucially, these studies identify no genetic signal corresponding to a distinct Celtic invasion at any point in later prehistory. There is, however, an important nuance. Genetic evidence suggests some influx into southern Britain towards the end of the late Bronze Age, particularly from populations connected to northern France. These populations are not genetically distinct from Britain. They derive from the same underlying ancestry: Western hunter-gatherer, early European farmer, and steppe-related ancestry, often with a somewhat higher proportion of early European farmer ancestry. This pattern fits regional mobility within an already closely related Northwest European population. Movements of this kind provide a plausible vector for cultural and linguistic change, including the spread of Celtic languages, without implying population replacement. When people imagine a Celtic invasion, several different processes are often collapsed into a single event: long-term population continuity, cross-channel mobility, and the later dominance of Celtic languages. The genetic evidence shows that Britain was not repeatedly conquered and resettled. Cultural and linguistic change took place within a largely continuous population, shaped by contact, mobility, and long-standing Atlantic and Channel networks. So did the Celts invade Britain? Not in the sense of a mass incoming people replacing the population. What the evidence supports is something more gradual and more consistent with what we see elsewhere. continuity of people, alongside cultural and linguistic change, possibly carried by regional movement from areas like northern France, among populations who were already closely related. Once Koch's definition of Celtic is taken seriously and set alongside the genetic evidence, the invasion model is no longer required. For the full archaeological and genetic discussion behind this, I explore the evidence in detail in this video here. Okay, so that concludes our clarification video for today. Thank you everybody who liked, shared and hyped the last video. Your support is very much appreciated. Thanks for watching and I'll catch you on the next one. Old boy, out.